This is a very special edition that we have because I'm honored to be surrounded by members and friends of the Committee on the Present Danger China. And we're going to be talking about all of the threats that China brings, including the economic threat in particular. And so I'm pleased to be joined by, to my right, Rosemary Gibson, who is the author of China RX, and really the lady who has led the charge on keeping American pharmaceuticals safe. And that's just been a tremendous effort, and we're making great progress thanks to her good work. And then to her right is the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, of which I'm happily a founding member. It's Brian Kennedy, and he's also the author of the book, Communist China's War Inside America. And then to my left is Chris Iacovella, who is the CEO of the American Securities Association. And then to his left is Frank Gaffney, the vice chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, a long-term friend of Economic War Room, and the founder and executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So glad you're here. I'd like to start with you, Brian, and tell us why the Committee on the Present Danger was formed and what's it doing.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for all you do. The Committee on the Present Danger China has existed at 4 different times. One at the start of the Cold War, one in the heart of the Cold War, one right after September 11th, and now here with China. In the very beginning, you have to remember Americans are an inward-looking people primarily. We look at how do we raise our families, what's going on in our church, what does it take to live a life as a free American? And so various intellectuals and national security professionals over the years have decided that Americans needed to know firsthand what was the threat to them. So it started the Cold War, they did that to understand that the Soviet Union was a threat. Back in the 1970s, at the heart of the Cold War, a lot of people looked at how America was addressing the Soviet Union and decided they needed to explain to the country just how serious a threat that was. Ronald Reagan was among them, and that helped bring in President Reagan. You had September 11th, of course, and now you have with Communist China, the American people hearing really for the first time from Donald Trump that it was an economic and strategic threat to them. And it was myself and Frank Gaffney and you and Steve Bannon and others who thought we need to explain to Americans today that Communist China presents a real threat to our existence. And so we've been doing everything we can to explain to the American people the nature of this threat. And we see here in year 4 of the Trump administration officials standing up and echoing many of the arguments we've been making. And so I think that's very both gratifying and encouraging for our countrymen that they're hearing from not just us and not just from President Trump, but the rest of his administration, that indeed Chinese malfeasance is not going to go unchecked.
What's so good about that is 10 years ago I was in the Pentagon and I was talking to them about the Chinese economic threat. But most of America has looked at me and said, well, China's our banker. Right? China makes the goods that we purchase at Walmart and that we enjoy and all that. So, China, they would never harm us. They like us. We're their best customer. And then I had the privilege of meeting Rosemary. And Rosemary, it's been a couple of years and you were one of the first guests on the Economic War Room, but you talked about the China threat in a way that was so personal that my dad and my in-laws and everybody that I knew, when I said, hey, did you know? Tell us about what you discovered and why you wrote the book, China RX.
Well, thank you, Kevin. The reality is that so many of our medicines we depend on China for, even during the coronavirus pandemic. We depend on China for most of the core materials to make the drugs we need to help people recover when they're in the hospital. And this was exposed for the first time in the book, China RX. And you're absolutely right. It takes what Brian said and tells a story to make it real for people. And wherever you are on the political spectrum, Democrat, Republican, everything in between, whether you're an industry titan, member of Congress, in the executive branch, or just the average person on the street, If you go into any hospital today, even brand name hospitals, you're going to be dependent on that 1-cent pill made in China.
Oh. And when I read your book and I read about heparin and realized that everybody that gets any surgery whatsoever needs a blood thinner of some type, and yet people died because they just didn't have the quality control.
That's right, and here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we saw what happened with substandard masks that didn't protect people, testing kits that didn't work, gowns that were contaminated with bacteria meant for operating rooms. And of course, we've had medicines with carcinogens in them that millions of Americans were taking. And just think about what we've learned in the context of the pandemic. We are unprepared for biowarfare.
Oh.
Wuhan not only was the source and location of the virus, but it's also a pharma alley for antibiotics that we need to treat people, like azithromycin. Think about that. So you control the weapon, and you control the antidote. And the public now is understanding this. And I'm really heartened to see policymakers on both sides of the aisle. It's hard to avoid this.
Big announcement from Kodak, regarding Kodak.
That's right. This morning at 6 a.m., article came out in the Wall Street Journal saying that Kodak in upstate New York will be creating 350 jobs to open up a plant. They're getting a loan from the Development Finance Corporation, and they're going to be making some of these core ingredients that are needed for our essential drugs. Because one thing you learn during a pandemic, you can't rely on anybody. You can't rely on your allies. The UK shut down exports. Half of the EU countries shut down exports. And it's understandable, because you need those products for your own people. So we have to have some degree of self-sufficiency just for the most essential drugs. So today's announcement was great, but we have a lot more work to do. We need 50 of those.
Yeah, well, our health depends on addressing the China threat, and that's a real issue that you've brought up. Kodak does a transition, because I'm watching CNBC this morning and watching the ticker roll by before the market opens, and Kodak, which is a $2 stock, is all of a sudden an $8 stock. And I was like, what happened? Have we given up digital photography? Are we going back? You know, and that talks about the power of the financial markets, where I want to bring you in, Chris, and talk about what we've seen as the China threat in our financial markets.
Well, the Chinese have been tapping our financial markets for the better part of the last 10 years to fund their rise, and to fund their military rise, to fund human rights abuses, while they destroy the planet. And so one of the things that we've been focused on is just taking a look at how they're accessing our capital markets. How is it possible that Chinese companies could be in the United States capital markets and not abide by the same rules as American companies?
Now describe that. What does it mean when we're not abiding by the same rules?
There was an agreement in 2013 which specifically permits Chinese companies not to have financial examinations. So what that means specifically to an investor is the following. In American companies, we put forth financial audits. Those audits are examined by our regulators, which means that you can verify whether or not the company is doing what it says it's doing, using invoices, doing business with other companies, and so forth. In China, when we try to do that, what happens is you get a stiff arm from the Chinese government, and they say, no, it's a national security privilege. You can't look at these documents. You're just going to have to trust us. The company's good, and whoever it does business with is good.
And what's the end result for an American investor who wants to buy into the Chinese market? I want to make a lot of money because China's the hot market. That's where I'm going to make my money, because half of Wall Street's telling us that constantly. So what's the end result if nobody's looking at the auditors and the audits?
Well, the end result is fraud, and the revelation that Wall Street has been peddling a lie for the last 10 years.
And that's Luckin Coffee.
Luckin Coffee is just one in a long line of frauds.
Yeah.
The fraud started with the reverse mergers, and they continued on with Luckin Coffee, and then there's been 2 more, Tal Education and a couple others that have revealed themselves. And you have Kangmei Pharmaceuticals, which is another one. So what you have is just systemic and pervasive defrauding of American investors.
Yeah, no, and we wouldn't allow this with American companies. They wouldn't be allowed to list, they wouldn't be allowed to remain, they'd be delisted and everything else if they don't meet these criteria. But real people are losing real money. People are losing their life, if they get tainted pharmaceuticals, and they're losing their money if they're buying into some of these Chinese accounting frauds, right?
Right, and now the Chinese have found another way to usurp our laws by putting companies that are specifically listed in China into indexes, which is the creation, the ingenious creation by Wall Street financiers. Let's create an index so that it can bypass all of the rules of our securities laws and put companies in them, and then tell the buyer of that index, oh, beware, these could be fraudulent companies, or they could be on the sanctions list, or they could be on the do not do business list. This is insanity that people are putting their money into these companies. And what we've been asking, what the committee's been asking, what it's been pushing for, is that these indexes with companies in them from China be removed from our marketplace. There is no good reason for American money to be funneled out of this country and into China, going straight to the Communist Party, when it should stay here funding middle-class entrepreneurs, workers of this country to create jobs and grow this economy.
Yeah, well, there's some good news on this. And Frank, I'm going to ask you to talk about the Thrift Savings Plan, because you pounded the table for months on the issue of the Thrift Savings Plan. Tell us about the Thrift Savings Plan and what the committee has helped to accomplish.
With pleasure, but let me start by saying thank you, Kevin. First of all, for Economic War Room and the incredible work that you're doing, which helps in some of these very causes. It's indispensable. Thanks, too, for the Falkirk Center for putting together this program, which I think has just been sensational, highly informative, and bringing together the right kinds of people, including these folks with whom I'm privileged to work with, among other things, the Committee on the Present Danger of China. One of the things that we took guidance from people like Chris on, and our colleague Roger Robinson, was when we discovered that this problem of putting our money in the hands of companies that are involved in everything from human rights violations to the national security imperiling of our country, we're going to have added to the list of investors several millions of present and previous federal government employees, civilian and military. And when you looked at that and you realized that that would translate into, as an example, persons currently serving in uniform, having their retirement savings invested in companies building the weapons with which they might be killed. And frankly, that was not just crazy, but it was morally repugnant. And we worked hard as a committee and as individuals, and with Chris's terrific organization, the American Securities Association, and Roger Robinson's RWR advisory group and the Prague Security Studies Institute. A coalition came together pleading with President Trump to intervene. And I think after an enormous amount of stonewalling by some of his subordinates, and I want to single out as one of the real malefactors in all of this, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Steven Mnuchin, who is a Wall Street guy, a Goldman Sachs guy, and is personally, I believe, as well as professionally, deeply invested in underwriting the Chinese communist threat. Now, he wouldn't put it quite that way, but that's the practical effect of it. And I think he was among those who were saying to the president, oh, no, you don't need to worry about this thrift savings plan, and was actually moving it along. And in the end, fortunately, thanks be to God, word got to the president. And immediately he responded as we knew he would, which was to say, no, we're not going to do that. And he intervened with the help of Larry Kudlow, his chief economic advisor, and Robert O'Brien, his chief national security advisor. And they wrote, not one actually, but now two very important letters, Kevin, which I know is available through economicwarroom.com, also presentdanger.com. You can find some of the best, clearest articulation of the kinds of problems we're discussing here and you do all the time from senior U.S. government officials. And to that number now have been added the director of the FBI and the Attorney General of the United States, and most recently, the Secretary of State. And all of them are now singing, as Brian said, off of essentially our hymn book, because it's right to be recognizing the threat the Chinese Communist Party represents, and it's wrong to be enabling it, especially with our money.
Yeah, and we're enabling a lot of things. And one of the things I want to bring up here is the elephant in the room. I mean, when I landed in Washington, I noticed on my phone it said 5G up in the corner. It's not actual 5G. It's not the same kind of 5G that we've been promised and that's coming, but that number scares me because I know a lot of the 5G equipment is made by Huawei. One of those companies where we have to be careful. The government says, oh, don't buy their equipment, but they've been selling around the world. Let's talk about that. Well, Brian, what are your thoughts on 5G and what we need to do regarding that?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a great question. I think it starts with, are we as a country going to make the investment in an alternative system to the one being developed by Huawei? I mean, we were told initially, all Americans, well, they've got such a lead on this, that would be a waste of time and money to try to suggest any alternative. If we go to any foreign competitor, well, they're going to have some relationship to Huawei as well. We as a country, if we want to secure our information and our intellectual property, and America, if it's anything, it's the creation of intellectual property, whether it's Silicon Valley or Hollywood or Wall Street or any part of America where you have information workers producing intellectual property, the protection of that is critical. We as a country need to develop a system that is completely secure and an alternative to whatever Huawei or the Chinese are producing. Because to give away that intellectual property is to give away the future of the country, as National Security Advisor O'Brien said. And so I think it's one thing to say it, now we have to do it. Good that we're stopping Huawei where we are, but we need to make major investments so that the alternative is real and available as we build out these systems across the country.
If the backbone of the next generation of the information economy is controlled by China, I mean, we know what China does with currently hacking and stealing of intellectual property. General Spalding was up on this stage yesterday as an expert on that, but they're doing it in pharmaceuticals too. We're seeing the Chinese are trying to steal the coronavirus treatments and theft. So Rosemary?
Sure, massive theft of the research that's going on for vaccines for coronavirus. That's probably billions and billions of dollars of human intellectual capital that's leaving the country. And it's destroying our R&D capability and eventually our industrial base to be able to do this work in the future. Families want to have jobs for their children and grandchildren. And these are good paying jobs that give you a sense of purpose in life, that you can serve humanity by restoring health and preventing disease. And we're losing that as we speak. We have to turn off the spigot and protect what we have, otherwise there'll be nothing left.
You know, I come into this business as a former Templeton portfolio guy. I worked for John Templeton, who was arguably the founder of global investing. No one led global investing more than Sir John Marks Templeton. And I visited China and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange with Dr. Mark Mobius, who's the premier emerging market manager of the world. Still doing a great job. Dr. Mobius, great guy. And yet, I find myself telling people we cannot invest in China, which is something that I was sold starting 1990, 1991. I sold for a decade on you have to invest in China because that seemed like that was the right thing to do and so forth. And now I'm saying,
come a long way, baby.
Oh my goodness. I said, we can't do this because you put together a portfolio and you realize half your portfolio, or not half, but a portion of your portfolio is stealing the intellectual property from another portion of your portfolio, and you're literally investing against yourself. Which goes back to this, I want to bring in the issue. The letter was written, Frank, to the Labor Secretary, right? We can't do this. And the Labor Secretary has put out a couple of really important letters. One of them was on thrift savings plan, and the other one was a comment on ESG. And they're open for comments now on ESG. And it seems like the
Better spell that acronym out.
environmental, social, and social justice is what I think, and governance. So we're holding American companies to this certain standard. You have to invest this certain way, aligned with these philosophical tenets, which is a whole other issue. We talk about the economic war room, because I think that the idea of investing should be to get the best possible legal return. Right. But I want to bring you in on this, Chris, because ESG, Secretary Scalia is asking for information on this. Talk about the role of ESG and China.
So you're bringing up a great point, and I just want to tie one thing together before we address the ESG in China, but it's that you said that one side of the portfolio could be stealing from another, and I think that's exactly right. I think we're sending money to China to fund its cyber army, which then attacks us. It attacks our accounts, it attacks our companies. They have said that they were going to stop stealing intellectual property, which no company has ever disclosed that its intellectual property has been stolen, but yet it's a huge problem that we have to stop. So I completely agree with you that this is part of the absurdity of what we're doing to embolden China. The other piece of the absurdity has to go directly to the environmental, social, and governance regime. And Secretary Scalia has put forth a very practical and reasonable proposal which says you must focus on getting the best return for your beneficiaries of your ERISA plan, retirement plan. And the issue here is
and by the way, Morningstar just reported out and said all advisors should oppose that, and Morningstar suggested that every advisor should be promoting ESG. And Morningstar is if you're not in the industry, you may not be familiar, but you grew up with Morningstar. Advisors look at Morningstar as like Bible, right? And they rate funds and they rate all these things. And Morningstar just said you have to support ESG.
That's right. Well, that's because they're part of the Wall Street cabal, along with MSCI and others who actually profiteer from advising and then creating ratings related to ESG. But to the extent that that is true, that all advisors must put their clients into ESG, then what that means to me is that every single advisor needs to look at the portfolio of their clients, from indexes to individual companies, and rip out the Chinese companies. Take every index out of there. Why? Because these people do not abide by environmental rules and regulations. They use slave labor to make micro components, iPhones, and so forth.
And shoes and clothing.
And Nikes and everything else. And so what you have is a situation where some in the elite establishment want to have it their way, but only on one portion of their way. And that's not how it works. If we're going to have ESG, then it needs to apply equally to everybody so that American companies aren't disadvantaged, and Chinese companies who operate in China, and any American company that operates in China, gets to have to deal with the exact same prohibitive requirements that ESG puts on it.
So you could be morally consistent and say, I don't believe in ESG and I don't want to invest in China. That's a morally consistent position. Or you could be morally consistent and say, I do believe in ESG and therefore I will not invest in China. Or you could say, I believe in China because I want the, quote, best possible return, not that I think you'll get it because of the fraud issue and everything else, and I won't invest in ESG. But it's not possible morally to be consistent to say, I believe in ESG and I will invest in China.
Can I just
jump in?
Make a perhaps outlandish observation, but I think it's true. And I just want to say this directly to the investors in our audience. The people like Larry Fink, for example, of BlackRock, or Ray Dalio of Bridgewater, or Steve Schwartzman, and these other masters of the universe. Schwartzman's at Blackstone. To the extent that they are buying in on this ESG agenda, the practical effect of that, the thing that makes it actually consistent, Kevin, is it's in the interest of communist China to be doing that to our industries. I mean, you know better than anybody, Kevin. You report on this all the time. You live in Dallas, Texas. ESG is fundamentally, let's be clear, the vehicle for trying to impose the AOC Green New Deal agenda through American boardrooms, through portfolios, on the rest of us, meaning taking down one of the most important, if arguably not actually the most important, of our industrial sectors, our energy sector. What could be better for China than to have the United States unilaterally dismantling one of its great strengths? So, you know, there's been some fascinating reporting on this of late, including by our friend Maria Bartiromo. As she's been talking with the Attorney General, in addition to the speech that he's made, and Ray Dalio, among others, the truth of the matter is these guys in Wall Street are actually playing for the other team.
Yep.
And I don't think it's too strong to suggest that that's treasonous in a time of war. And interestingly enough, Ray Dalio on Maria's show twice now on Fox News has actually said, we are at war. He says we're at war on technology, we're at war on trade, we're on war on geopolitics, and maybe on the capital markets too, he says. If we don't understand that's what we're up against, is an enemy that is determined to destroy us, and that it is madness for us to be helping them do it, and actually treasonous, then we deserve the fate we're going to have.
Yeah, you can't be morally consistent and support ESG and investing in China, but you can be intellectually consistent if you want China to win.
Exactly.
And that is the only possible explanation.
Exactly.
You know, when you Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, that's it. There are people on Wall Street playing with China's interests at heart. Right. And that's a frightening thing.
Yeah. And to his credit, the Attorney General called them out. He said, if their counterparts in the 1930s and 40s had had the same attitude, and some did, truthfully, but if they had en masse, we'd be speaking German.
Yeah,
he said.
There actually were some economic traders during the 1930s and 40s that were supporting the Nazi regime, and fortunately,
Henry Ford got a decoration from the Third Reich for his service to it.
And it's not just Wall Street; it's the pharmaceutical industry too. It is you go across the board and you look at the effort. China has really done a number on this nation, because 20 years ago when they wrote Unrestricted Warfare, now 21, almost 22 years ago, nobody listened. Nobody believed it, because we always thought, well, they support us, they invest in our bonds, they're such good allies. But when you have circumstances like you've documented, Rosemary, where people have literally died, if that were an American company and American pharmaceutical company, and they produced a drug that killed people, what would happen to that company?
Well, in this case, there were a lot of cases filed, but the reality is if it's a Chinese company, you have no recourse.
Right.
And just to underscore this point, whose team are people on, there has been in the wings a Buy American executive order that would have the Department of Defense, the VA, the Strategic National Stockpile, and HHS use our taxpayer dollars to buy medicines, medical countermeasures we need during a pandemic, to buy from US-based manufacturers. And what that will do is reinvigorate our industrial base, assure our national security, our health security. And it's stunning and remarkable to see the opposition to Buy American for essential drugs for our veterans, for our military, for our seniors. There's actually been headlines saying Buy American could cause more harm than good. Earlier this year, special interests in Washington circulated a letter to the president saying, oh, we can't buy American. And we're not talking about returning the whole supply chain here, just those 200, 300 drugs you need for a healthcare system to function, which is our 18% of our GDP. They came out and said, oh no, if we buy American, that will disrupt our supply chains.
Can't have that.
And then, a couple days later, at the G20 virtual meeting, Chinese leadership said, oh no, we don't want to mess with our supply chains. It was the exact same language and message. And here's what's happening. Here's why we're seeing what we're seeing in the opposition. I remember talking to a gentleman who used to work for IBM. And if you have a ThinkPad, it used to be made by IBM, and now it's made in China. I said, so how did that happen? He said, well, we wanted to get into China market, higher-end products, 1.3 billion people. So we basically gave away that technology to China to curry favor. The exact same thing has happened with our generic drugs. They're commodity products, not going to make a lot of money like the branded products. So companies that want to do a lot of business in China with their branded medicines to sell them to 1.3 billion people are throwing our whole generic industry, again, 90% of our medicines, handing it over to China. And this was confirmed by someone who worked in one of these big companies and watched it happen. All the specs to make our antibiotics, not licensing, just giving it away. And as someone in the industry wrote on the back of China RX in a comment, the American people have been thrown under the bus. So we have to decide, whose side are you on? And meanwhile, with the recent executive order on importing medicines from Canada, that's viewed as unsafe. It's unsafe to import medicines from Canada. But there's nothing about how it's unsafe to import medicines from China.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And the American people understand this now. The mask has come off, so to speak, and they're understanding the games that are being played with something that's so personal.
Yeah. Well, we're called the economic war room for a reason. This is economics, and at the bottom line, it's all about the money. So, Brian, are we in an economic war with China?
Yes, but let's be clear, we couldn't even use the phrase economic war until very recently. And your own work really has been to socialize among smart people the notion that we're in an economic war. And so getting that right is essential. Look, Americans were sold the idea that globalism would make them wealthy. Well, globalism made somebody wealthy, some group wealthy. It made
Wall Street.
It made financiers on Wall Street wealthy. The American worker, he did not get wealthy over this. He became ever more poor. Abraham Lincoln was asked at the Wisconsin State Fair back in, I think, 1860, what was superior, capital or labor? Now, you talk to most Republicans, they would think, well, I wonder how he answered that. And you would think he might say capital, because capital creates jobs, et cetera. He said labor, surprisingly. He said free men working as laborers can make money and eventually start their own businesses. And that the government had to have a view of protecting labor. Labor as in the free labor of a free people so that they can make money. Globalism, their view is whatever helps Wall Street and finance and capital, that's good. The American worker, not so important. Donald Trump comes along and says, wait a minute, what about the American worker? How do we protect him? Who is going after him today? And it's a combination, as you've said, of both Wall Street and China. Let's move their labor, that of the American people, to China.
Yeah.
Let them get rich. And the American worker, on the other hand, is going to suffer. And that's what we see.
Yeah, and the threat is just, it's striking because it's your life, your livelihood, and your way of life. We're talking about all three of it. The life from the pharmaceutical drugs, your livelihood, whether you get to keep a job or whether you get to invest in the future. And it comes down to even way of life. I mean, I think Roy Jones, you all familiar with Roy Jones, Marriott employee. Roy, working away happily for Marriott in Nebraska, his job was to find on social media when positive things were said about Marriott. And a Tibetan group happened to stay at a Marriott, have a good experience, and they liked the fact that Marriott treated them well. So he's like, hey, my job is to like that tweet. And he did. He liked the tweet. He said, yay. Chinese Communist Party informed Marriott that they might lose some of their hotels in China if they didn't fire Roy Jones. He had no idea that he'd done something wrong. Social credit score happening right here in the United States, lost his job because he said something. You know, you see the same thing with LeBron James, you know, trying to protect the NBA and everything else. The idea is that China is going to constrict our way of life, which is free speech. Who wants to talk about social credit scores?
Well, can I add a sort of a piece about our life and livelihoods?
Yeah.
And it's sort of a social credit score. You know, during this pandemic, one of the things that we've learned is that in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that there was a Chinese investor who owned 34 hospitals in Australia. And during a pandemic, said to the government, well, we're going to close down these hospitals unless you pay us more money. What this is illustrating, we've talked about basic medicines that we need and China makes them. That is just the tip of the iceberg. And that big iceberg is the infiltration by China of our civilian and military healthcare systems.
Right.
Again, life,
It's
livelihood, way of life.
collecting the DNA, it's medical devices, medical equipment, and eventually ownership of hospitals and other healthcare facilities. In Canada, the Chinese Communist Party owns nursing homes. Think about that. And so we have to look at it not just from a manufacturing and industrial base perspective, but what kind of investments are coming here into this country, deep into our system. So we need a strategy with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States as well, the manufacturing side, because the impact on our life and livelihoods would be so profound, and the sense of helplessness people would feel would be off the charts.
It's very real.
Can I tie a couple of these things together?
Yeah.
Because one company that is in our capital markets, that is deeply engaged in oppression of the Chinese people, and that we just learned is actually a communist Chinese military company, identified as such by the Pentagon, one of over 20 that are doing business in this country. To your point about where's CFIUS, this Committee on Foreign Investment, they're doing business in our country. What is the business of the People's Liberation Army? The last time I checked, it is destroying the United States of America. What on earth are we doing, having 20 plus companies of the People's Liberation Army doing business in our country? But to this very point, the social credit system of China, which is used to incarcerate at least 1 million, I've heard as many as 3 million Uyghurs, that is used to monitor Christians and Tibetans and Buddhists of other kinds and
Falun Gong
and well, for that matter, every Chinese, is made possible by Hikvision. Because Hikvision's surveillance state apparatuses, cameras, and the work that it does on facial recognition and gait recognition, the big data, the quantum computing, all of this is put together to enable essentially real-time, 24/7 monitoring of everybody by the Chinese Communist Party. And it's being underwritten by Wall Street.
Yep.
And the worst of it is, in a way, bad as all of that is, they're exporting it.
Yeah.
So, as Rosemary was just indicating, maybe it's incremental here at the moment. I think the healthcare system is one of the main lines of attack. Our friend David Goldman says they are all about big data in the healthcare industry. But here's the kicker. the spread of the Chinese Communist Party's influence, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative or whether it's through deep penetration and subversion and corruption or all of the above, is enabled by some of these companies that we are bankrolling to engage in this kind of activity. It's scandalous. It's not actually legal to do business with the Hikvision.
Well,
but you can invest in it.
Let's take a look at what happened in just 20 years. In the year 2000, when the U.S.-China trade deal was up for a vote in Congress, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was having a meeting of businesses that were going to go up to the Hill to lobby for it. And a Chinese delegation came down Connecticut Avenue and gave those businesses in the Chamber of Commerce their talking points. And they tracked to see whether those companies did the right bidding, who they visited. So that was 2000.
Wow.
So where are we in, say, 2019? The DC Metro system put out a bid for new rail cars. And fortunately, the two senators in Maryland and the two senators in Virginia, it shows how real it is, said, no way will you still get federal funding if China, which has done this in other cities, if China builds those rail cars. And here's why. It would have facial recognition technology on those cars.
Of course.
So think of everybody who takes the metro in DC. People work on the Hill, in the court system, in the executive branch, in industry. They know exactly who's going where and when and who they're meeting. And the second thing is you'd have free Wi-Fi. A great hunting ground to find out what's going on in government and industry.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, if you're the African National Congress and you ask the Chinese to build your headquarters, and they do, and then you find bugs everywhere.
African National Union.
Yes, and then there's this story of an individual. He says, I don't see what the big deal is. I'm an American. I used to work in New York. Now I work in Beijing. Every night, I go to work during the day. Every night I go out and have drinks with my friends. I have dinner with my friends. And all of a sudden, it's all the same. You know, America, China, it's all the same, morally equivalent. And then one night, he shows up for drinks. And when he arrives, he's shaken. What's wrong? And he says, I was walking here and I did something I've done in New York 100 times. I've done it here 100 times, but I got a picture on my phone sent to me by a message that says, you just jaywalked and you're being fined, and the fine is already removed from your checking account and you've lost social credit points. And he was shaken. And like you said, Frank, what starts in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but what starts in China does not stay in China. Amen. That is the intention, to bring it here. And if they hack the Office of Personnel Management, and they did, and Equifax, and all of these other things, and they gather our data, including your 23andMe health information, and they hack TikTok, they have all this information. They can control us. They can send you a message on your smart device and say, we own you, you will do this. And that's what we're facing. That is a very real, direct threat on your personal liberty, your economic liberty, and your health. Every one of them is directly threatened by China. This is not our traditional warfare. It's going to hit your money, everything else.
So can we just pivot to one of the things that I'm particularly excited that the Committee on the Present Danger China is supporting, but you personally are in the vanguard on it. I want to again thank the Falkirk Center for the role that it's playing. Would you talk a little bit about patriotic investing and the alternatives to ESG that you've been trying to educate people to pursue?
Yeah, and I'd like to bring Chris in on this, because maybe 10 years ago, we kind of saw this coming, and I'd written books, done Pentagon reports and so forth, saw this coming, and we said, we've got to get to financial advisors, because Wall Street's corrupt. We got to get to the individual client-facing advisor. It could be the stockbrokers that are in the member firms of the American Securities Association. It could be independent financial planners. We got to get to them because they're client-facing. And Wall Street, the big firms on high, the Goldman Sachs of the world, may push this idea that we got to do ESG and you got to do China. And that may coming from Larry Fink and BlackRock or whatever. But my father was a broker originally at Stifel Nicholas. I think Stifel Nicholas is a part of your association. And he cared what his clients thought as much or more as what he cared what the firm thought. And those guys, they're mobile, they can change firms and so forth. The clients were what mattered to him. And when the clients realized that they were investing things against their personal values, and when they were woke to that, they started to say to my dad, hey, I want to invest patriotically. So I grew up with this. I grew up with the idea. So instead of ESG, we came up with LSV. And we're going to have a panel on this. We hired John McLaughlin, who did a poll to see what American investors really want. They want liberty, security, and values. Even high net worth investors, you ask them the top things they're most interested in, they say family and country. Those are the top two on the polls. Wow. ESG are way down the list of what they're interested in. But we can't talk the Wall Street firms into that. They're sold off to the globalist agenda. So we're training financial advisors to help clients get what they want with their portfolio. If it's your money, why should it not be invested in how you want it invested? Why does it have to be the way some god on Wall Street, master of the universe, says? So we're training financial advisors in conjunction with Liberty University starting this fall, where you can send your advisor. You can go to economicwarroom.com/advisor. Give us the name of your advisor and we'll contact them and ask them if they want to be part of this training program. Because when we ask individual clients, they want their money invested to their values. Either give me the best possible return and not hurt my country, or invest it in liberty, security, and Western civilization values. So Chris, you've got members, and your members, they don't want to see America destroyed. They're Main Street America.
That's right. And one of the things we did, actually, talking about the theme that hits home on this, and just what we were talking about before, we sued the Securities and Exchange Commission because they actually created a rulemaking that would require the SEC to form a database that takes every American investor's personally identifiable information and their financial information and centralizes it here in Washington. And our point of view was, first of all, that's a violation of privacy of our customers, and we're going to stand up for it. And second of all, this is ripe one-stop shop for cyber criminals, right? Especially from China. And they're known to do this. And then we have the SEC chair constantly pushing back on us from Wall Street. So
the guy who, by the way, when he was on Wall Street, did the lawyering for the largest, at the time, IPO in Wall Street history, namely Alibaba, one of the huge Chinese Communist Party-tied conglomerates. So do you think he might have a conflict of interest? I don't want to put you on the spot, Chris. I think he has a conflict of interest. Jay Clayton has a conflict of interest. And this is the guy who is running our Securities and Exchange Commission. This is the guy who is absolutely fine with that MOU that says the Chinese don't have to comply with our securities laws and regulations. This is the guy who is pushing back, along with Mnuchin and these others, on basically the entire administration's clear-eyed course correction on not enabling the Chinese Communist Party to be an even bigger threat to us in the future than it is today. It's scandalous.
And the reason I bring up this database is because if there was a very progressive administration that came in, they could use this database to scrutinize what's in your portfolio and then look to see whether you were an ESG investor or you weren't an ESG investor. And maybe then they start to tell you that you can't access the market until you have a specific percentage of your portfolio allocated towards these investments.
Or maybe towards treasury bonds, because if we get into financial trouble and they try and force that, that's how we fund the government. What I love about the association that you represent is the fact that your member firms care about their customers.
That's exactly right.
And the country.
And the country. Well, the customers care about the country. And so by default, you can't be a member firm and be against America in the American Securities Association because the customers are Americans.
That's right. And I think on your values investing, the thing that your retail investor audience needs to understand is every dollar you put into an index that's run by 3 companies, State Street, BlackRock, Vanguard, gives them the power and control to implement any agenda, political, social, or otherwise, into the boardroom. It gives them the ability to inject politics that should be debated, discussed by representatives of people here in Washington in the boardroom. And when you start to see chaos in America and companies picking sides because they're worried about a liberal establishment press beating down their door, this is exactly what is happening. This is why it's happening. They wouldn't have any pressure to do that on them if it wasn't for all of this index and passive investment. And so when you think about the liberty and value investing, if you're going to do it, then it must be in an index that is unrelated to people who don't have your best agenda and your best interest at heart.
No question. You know what I think is interesting? Frank, you came out of the Defense Department. You work there. We have been discussing for about an hour warfare, and we have not once mentioned actual kinetic military capability. That's not even been discussed. That's still a threat with China. We have been funding that. We have been supporting it. Our military is under threat because they may not get the medicines that they need in order to fight. I mean, if there were an anthrax attack, God forbid, do we have the medicine to stop that? But tell us a little bit about the Chinese military threat and how that's advanced.
Well, I think for the record, I did mention it in response to your first question about the Thrift Savings Plan. The idea that our military personnel would be investing in companies like Hikvision and like Huawei and like others that are tied to the Chinese Communist Party's military-industrial complex is obscene and reckless, especially since what those various industrial giants now in China, whether it's the shipbuilding giants, China shipbuilding industry, whether it's the aviation industry corporation, AVIC, whether it's any number of others that are involved in building out the South China Sea telecommunications networks that support their ability to project power and exercise dominion over those vital strategic waters. Talk about commercial waters. There's $1 trillion or so of commerce that passes through or over them every year. And the Chinese now will be able to say, you can't do that without our permission. But the buildup, Kevin, to your point, the buildup of all of these capabilities, it's been described to me I do a radio show with you, among others, every day called Secure Freedom Radio. We talk about this relentlessly because one of the things that's happening now is not only that the Chinese Communist Party's military-industrial complex is, with our money, building more ships, planes, missiles, submarines, exotic weapons of various kinds, including nuclear ones.
And space.
And acquiring the capability to dominate space and build out this colonial infrastructure that will enable them to further project power. They're doing all of that quantitatively in ways that overmatch us. And increasingly, theirs are going to be qualitatively superior to ours, their ships, their planes, their missiles, and so on. So the combination of all of this, Kevin, and I'm glad we were able to get to this very directly, of the various other kinds of warfare that, as you have so importantly pointed out, is built into the strategy of unrestricted warfare, which was written before they had the option, right, of kinetic. They have that option now. And I think it's a very odds-on bet that they will use that kinetic warfare, if not against us directly, against Taiwan.
Against Taiwan, exactly.
Perhaps others out there, but probably against us as well, because we might get in the way of what they have in mind for Taiwan.
And you stop and you think about that. Taiwan is watching what happened in Hong Kong, and they're saying, look at this. And if you want to see how much they're embedded in our system, start a meme, Hong Kong Lives Matter, and tweet that out and put that out and see, because there are people in Hong Kong who have disappeared and been killed by the Chinese Communist Party. Good, solid, wonderful people killed. Lots of them, more than perhaps have been killed by police officers and Black Lives Matter and so forth.
Considerably more.
If you're woke to caring about lives, you should be woke to caring about the Hong Kong lives. And you put that down and you will be snuffed out in conversation. You will be told you can't, it's not appropriate. Canceled. Cancel culture. So you see all of the tie-ins and the insidious nature to control. You know, this is what we talk about in the economic war room all the time. And in fact, we'll have a battle plan from this episode like we do every episode. You go to economicwarroom.com and you can click and download the battle plan. It's going to have the backgrounds on Frank and Chris and Rosemary and Brian, and it's going to talk about the issues, and we'll recap all of the issues that are involved here, and then we'll give you links to information where you can actually go and look it up for yourself. You don't take our word for it. It's all valid, it's all justified, it's all supported, and it's all written in Chinese military doctrine, unrestricted warfare, and we've been talking about it for a long time. Now it's very real, and it's coming after you. We say this all the time in the economic war room. We say what we see as a marketplace to get our stocks, marketplace to get our drugs, marketplace to be on Twitter. We see that as a marketplace. Oh yeah, because it's a global economy. Our enemies view as a battle space, and China is a master at capturing almost every one of these battle spaces. So I want to thank you all for being part of the economic war room today. And I want to encourage all of our viewers, go download the battle plan. Realize this is directed at you. It's directed at your health, it's directed at your job, it's directed at your ability to speak or keep a job or invest your money. However it is, it's directed at very real things. And you haven't seen it for 20 years, and it's all coming to the front right now.
Amen.
So thank you all. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.